When I saw the bruise, everything my uniform ever meant snapped into a different shape, not a shield for strangers, but a weight I could use to protect my own. My name is Paul Carter. I'm 58, retired from the city police force for 6 years now, though the uniform and the habits of it never really left me. I still keep a pressed shirt in the back of my closet, the thin blue fabric folded over like a promise to a younger self. People call me Steady. My neighbors know me as the man who waters the sidewalk roses at dawn and waves at the high school kids walking to class. My daughter Leah calls me Dad, sometimes with a laugh that still catches me like a summer breeze. But last night she called me with the kind of voice that doesn't have room for jokes. She said 3 words and then started to sob. He hit me. I sat in my recliner like a statue for a long minute, the TV droning on with a half-forgotten baseball game. Memories came in the way sirens come in a storm, distant at first, then impossibly close. After 3 decades wearing that uniform, you learn to categorize danger, to measure harm in small, factual units. But nothing in procedure prepared you for your child's voice breaking over the phone. Nothing in a manual told you how it tilts your world axis. Leah lives 2 towns over. She married David, a good kid, 30, mechanic hands, cracked wisdom teeth, hauled himself up on grit and a little bad luck. I liked him at first, steady laugh, decent job, he brought flowers once when Leah had a rotten week. But men are complex. People are complex. A bruise on your child's body simplifies a lot of moral equivocations. When I saw her the next morning, the bruise was purple, a dark bruise curving under her collarbone like a crescent moon. Leah tried to pull her shirt higher, to hide it with a fold of fabric, but the mark had its own gravity. She limped a little when she walked, as if her body now expected blows and was compensating for them. She avoided my eyes like she was ashamed of being seen with damage. No child should be ashamed of pain, but abusers teach shame like crooked teachers. We sat at her kitchen table, the kettle singing to itself, the cup between my hands and my heart pounding a rhythm I remembered from too many call-outs. She told me what happened in bursts: a fight, a spilled beer, a thrown phone, a hand that went too far. She said, "It's my fault. I should have left the keys in the car." That line sliced me open. I had seen that combination of blame and rationalization before in victims. It is the most insidious trick of violence. It convinces the wounded that the wound was their doing. I'd been a cop long before I was a father. There's a training, formal but hardly enough, about domestic incidents: listen, separate, document, protect. You learn to file reports and offer hotlines and make safety plans. But there's a difference between doing the professional thing and feeling the animal thing. The uniform taught me a methodical restraint. The father in me had other inclinations. At 72 hours, 2 colleagues called me, and the city still sends birthday letters on my old birthday. Old habits are like muscle memory. I felt the weight of the badge tucked away in my chest, not visible, but there. The sirens of my past life didn't howl for the perpetrator. They shouted for protocol, evidence, chain of custody. I thought about the legal avenues: a restraining order, a police report, testimonies. I thought about Leah's pride and the messy realities that follow a public complaint: jobs affected, reputations torn, families split. I remembered cases where reports led nowhere because a victim recanted at the last minute, or worse, where the legal system re-victimizes the person left holding the bruised truth. David swore it was an accident. He told friends he made a mistake. He called Leah crying the next morning, promising he'd change. The world loves a repentant story. I didn't want to destroy a marriage if there was honestly a wrong that could be repaired. But the bruise on my daughter's body was not the same as a broken dish or a sharp word. It was a physical grammar for something deeper. That afternoon I did what every instinct inside me told me I should. I put on my jacket. Not the uniform, not yet. Just my old windbreaker, the one with the faint department patch at the seam from years ago. I drove to the garage where David worked. The road between our town and his filled with the low, wet smell of late autumn. The engine hummed like a heartbeat, measured and persistent. My hands tightened on the wheel. When I pulled up outside the shop, I took a breath and felt the old calm settle. There is a clarity in the uniform that I miss. When you wear it, the randomness of the world narrows into problems to be solved. I hadn't planned to escalate anything. I planned to watch, to listen, to gather the things you need if you're going to hold someone accountable. If this was to be handled like my job, it would follow chain of evidence, not the hot flash of a father's fury. I walked into the shop with Leah's bruise still vivid in my mind, like a map to follow. The smell of oil and metal was loud and practical. David looked up from under an engine hood, wrench in hand. He smiled, a little sheepish, the way a man tries to appear casual when he knows there's tension. He wiped his palms on a rag. "Hey, Mr. Carter," he said, voice steady but brittle. "Everything okay?" "Just checking the place out," I said. The patch on my windbreaker caught the morning light. He noticed it. Men who work with their hands tend to notice insignias. He straightened, the animal part of him rising like steam. There was a moment, a taut pause where a man chooses the script he will believe. David's jaw tightened. Leah's bruise had become a story. Stories can be reshaped. I didn't accuse him in front of his boys or in front of the fluorescent lights. Accusation without proof is a kind of lawless violence. I asked a few questions about the night before, careful, measured, just like the old training told me. Where were you between 10 and midnight? Did anyone see you leave? What happened after the fight? He stammered. He said he'd been drinking. He said he'd been frustrated about bills. He said he'd never meant to hurt her, that it was an accident, and he was sorry. I watched him. There was a softness in his apologies that might have been real. There was also the tightness in his hand where he gripped the wrench like a promise. The shop boys drifted near, curious. I felt my father instinct lock with my cop instinct: documentation, witnesses, cover the bases. When I left the garage, I did not drive straight home. I drove to the station. The old building still smelled the same: coffee and old paper. For a retired cop, filing a report is a ritual you can do even when you're off the clock. It's the language of accountability. I sat at a desk and told myself I would be careful, that I would act like the law suggests. But the truth is, when you see your child with a bruise and her eyes already practicing apologies for the pain she did not cause, patience becomes an expensive indulgence. That night I put the pressed uniform shirt on. Not the full rig, no badge, no gun, but the shirt itself, the blue fabric smoothed over my shoulders. It fits differently now. Age changes the way you carry things. I stood before the mirror and looked at my reflection, a father, a man who had once sworn to protect his city, preparing to protect his own. When I left Leah's house afterward, the moon was a thin coin in the sky. I drove slow, the houses dim and watching. The badge that was not pinned to my chest still weighed on me. I knew then the road ahead would not be neat. It would be law and grit, paper and patience, and maybe, if things grew uglier, the kind of confrontation the training drills had only practiced in the background of fluorescent-lit classrooms. But the bruise was not going to be the last mark left on our family's skin. Not if I could help it. A bruise on my daughter's skin wasn't just a mark of violence. It was a challenge, one I couldn't ignore. And when I knocked on his door, I wasn't just her father. I was every lesson my badge had ever taught me. The next morning, I put on the uniform shirt. Not the badge, not the gun. I wasn't on duty anymore. But the shirt itself carried a weight, a history that even men like David could feel in their bones. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about posture. Authority. About reminding him that there are lines you don't cross. Leah begged me not to. She stood in the doorway of her small house, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes still puffy from crying. "Dad, please don't make it worse." He said he was sorry. He said it won't happen again. I cupped her cheek gently, my thumb brushing the edge of that fading bruise. "Sweetheart," I said, my voice low but steady, "men don't just stumble into raising their hand against someone they love. Once that line is crossed, it's crossed. And if he thinks an apology erases that, then he doesn't understand what he's done." She cried quietly but didn't stop me. Maybe part of her wanted me to go. Maybe she needed someone to carry the rage she wasn't ready to feel. David's house was small, a rental on the edge of town with paint peeling off the siding and weeds growing high around the porch. I parked my truck out front, got out slowly, deliberately. No rush. Men like him expect a rush. Loud shouts, slammed doors, chaos. Calm unnerves them more. When he opened the door, he froze. His eyes flicked to the uniform shirt, then to my face. He forced a grin, one corner of his mouth twitching like a faulty wire. "Mr. Carter," he said, trying to sound casual. "Didn't expect a visit." I stepped forward, close enough for him to feel my shadow. "We need to talk," I said. He tried to laugh it off, running a hand through his hair. "Leah told you, huh? Look, it was nothing. Just a fight. Things got heated." I didn't mean. I cut him off with a look. 30 years in uniform teaches you how to silence a man without saying a word. His voice faltered, died in his throat. "You put your hands on my daughter," I said finally, my voice low and even. "You left a bruise on her. That's not nothing. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." For a moment, something flared in his eyes, not guilt, not shame, but defensiveness. The look of a man caught but not repentant. "She pushed me first," he muttered too quickly. "She was yelling, and—" I stepped closer, my voice still calm. "You think a bruise on her shoulder is justified? You think I raised my daughter for 30 years so some mechanic with beer on his breath could leave his mark on her skin?" He swallowed hard, but I didn't let up. "I don't care if you drink. I don't care if you yell. But if you ever touch her again, David, I won't come here as her father. I'll come here as the man who spent 3 decades learning how to dismantle men who thought the law didn't apply to them." The silence stretched. He looked away, muttered something about being sorry. But the apology was weak, hollow. I turned and walked back to my truck, every step deliberate. I didn't slam doors or throw threats over my shoulder. Men like him thrive on bluster, on chaos. I left him with something worse, the quiet certainty that I was watching, waiting, ready. When I got back to Leah's house, she was pacing in the kitchen. She stopped when she saw me. "What did you do?" she asked, half afraid of the answer. "I told him the truth," I said simply. "Now we wait and see if he's stupid enough to test me again." But deep down, I already knew this wasn't over. Bruises fade. Fear lingers. And men who raise their hands once often find a reason to do it again. And if he did, I'd be ready, not just as a father, but as a man who had never forgotten how to wear the uniform. The first bruise was a warning. The second was a declaration. And when I saw it, I knew David had just crossed into a territory he couldn't walk back from. 2 weeks passed in a strained kind of silence. Leah called me every few days, her voice bright on the surface but carrying cracks beneath it. "We're working on things," she'd say, and I could hear the rehearsed optimism, the way victims cling to the hope that love can override fear. I wanted to believe her. God knows I did. But I also knew the look in David's eyes that day at the garage, defensive, slippery, a man who hadn't admitted guilt but only swallowed it until the moment passed. When you wear a uniform for 3 decades, you learn to read patterns the way a hunter reads tracks. Violence in a home is rarely a one-time storm. It's weather that settles in, each outburst paving the way for the next. So when Leah showed up at my door one Sunday afternoon, my heart sank before she even spoke. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup thicker than usual, but no foundation in the world could hide the swelling around her wrist. A faint yellow bruise bloomed just above the bone, half hidden under her sweater sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes wet. "Please don't do anything rash." I reached for her hand, gently pushing the sleeve back. She flinched, not from me, but from memory. The mark stared back at me like a signature. My throat tightened. "He did this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded, tears spilling now. "He grabbed me. It wasn't like before. He just lost his temper. But he said he's sorry. He promised it won't happen again." Leah, I said, keeping my voice steady though my blood roared in my ears. He's already promised that once. Promises from men like him aren't worth the breath it takes to make them. She shook her head desperately. Dad, please. I can handle this. If you go storming over there. I pulled her into a hug, holding her tight while she trembled. But inside, my decision was already carved in stone. That night, I pulled the uniform shirt out again. This time I laid the badge across the dresser too. I hadn't worn it in years, but its shine hadn't dulled. It caught the lamplight like a shard of judgment. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror, older, lined, but steady. I wasn't going to kick down doors or swing fists. That wasn't justice. That was vengeance. And vengeance without discipline only makes things worse. But I was going to draw a line. I drove to David's house just after dark. The neighborhood was quiet, porches glowing with warm lights, families settling in for the night. His truck sat in the driveway, a half-empty beer can balanced on the tailgate. Typical. He opened the door after my knock, eyes narrowing at the sight of me in uniform. He smirked, trying to cover the flicker of unease. What, you playing dress-up now, old man? I stepped past him into the living room, calm and deliberate. Sit down, I said. For a moment he bristled, jaw tight, but then he sat. Authority still works, even on men who claim they don't respect it. I stayed standing, looming over him. I saw Leah's wrist, I said. You laid hands on her again. He tried to speak, but I cut him off. Save it. I don't care about your excuses. You think I don't know the cycle? You think I haven't seen 100 men like you, swearing it was an accident, swearing they'll change, swearing it'll never happen again? Let me make this simple. It will happen again, because it already has. His eyes darted, his bravado cracking. She told you that? She exaggerates. You know how women get. That line, dismissive, contemptuous, snapped something in me. I leaned closer, my voice low and deadly calm. Listen carefully. You ever touch her again, in anger, in drunkenness, in anything less than love, and I won't come here to talk. I'll come here with the full force of everything I know about how men like you are taken apart by the law. I'll drag every lie you've ever told, every debt, every fight, every record into the daylight. And if the law isn't enough, then you and I will have a different kind of conversation. For a long moment he just stared at me. Then he swallowed, nodded stiffly, muttering, Fine. I left without another word. The cool night air hit me like a baptism. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't raised my hand. But I'd drawn the line in a language he understood. Still, as I drove home, I knew lines alone don't always hold. Men like David test boundaries the way rust tests steel, slow, persistent, until one day the whole structure groans under the weight. And if he tested mine again, he'd learn exactly how much strength was left in the man who once wore the badge. Threats only scare a man for so long. Eventually, he decides to push back, and when David did, he made the mistake of forgetting I wasn't just a father. I was a man who had built his life facing men like him. The days after my warning were uneasy, like waiting for a storm you know is coming but can't see yet on the horizon. Leah told me things were better. David was quiet, apologetic, cooking dinners, even buying her flowers. That's the cycle: abuse followed by remorse, followed by promises, followed by calm. I'd seen it in 100 households before, walking in with my badge to mediate yet another domestic call. The calm always cracked. Always. One night, Leah came over for dinner. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, stirring her mashed potatoes without eating. Anna, my wife, her mother, tried to lighten the mood with small talk, but I caught Leah's eyes and saw the shadow there. When Anna stepped into the kitchen, Leah leaned closer. He knows you came over, she whispered. He said if you interfere again, he'll... She stopped herself, biting her lip. He'll what? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork. He said he'll make sure you regret it. That you're old, retired, not protected anymore. He's not afraid of you, Dad." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to breathe slow. Inside, the old instincts flared, the ones that told me to end this now, permanently. But anger alone never won fights. Strategy did. That night, when Leah went home, I sat in my office staring at the uniform hanging on the back of the door. The shirt, the badge, the years of discipline stitched into the fabric. I remembered standing in doorways with partners, reading a scene before stepping inside. Assess, predict, plan. David was testing me, waiting to see if my threats were empty. Men like him live on dominance, on proving they're in control. If he thought fear didn't work on me, he'd escalate. That was inevitable. The test came sooner than I expected. 2 nights later, I heard tires on gravel outside my house. It was close to midnight. I went to the window and saw David's truck idling at the curb, exhaust curling into the cold air. My porch light threw just enough glow to show his outline behind the wheel. He didn't get out. He just sat there, engine rumbling, like a wolf circling a campsite. Anna stirred upstairs, calling down, "Paul? Who's out there?" "Go back to bed," I told her. My voice was calm, but my pulse thudded in my throat. I pulled on my boots, slipped the badge into my pocket, not on my chest, but close enough to remind me who I was, and stepped outside. The night air was sharp, carrying the smell of damp leaves. I walked down the steps slowly, deliberately, and crossed the yard until I was close enough to see David's face in the cab. He looked back at me, his expression somewhere between smug and unhinged. "Late night for a drive," I said evenly. He smirked, revving the engine. "Just wanted to see if the old man was still awake." "You've seen me," I said. "Now drive home." He leaned out the window, the sour tang of alcohol drifting across the night. "You think that badge in your pocket scares me? You're not a cop anymore. You're just some washed-up has-been hiding behind a shirt that doesn't fit you." I didn't rise to it. I just stood there, hands in my jacket, watching him. Silence unsettles bullies more than shouting. After a long moment, he spat on the pavement, slammed the truck into gear, and tore off down the street, tires spitting gravel. I stood in the cold a long time after the taillights vanished, my breath fogging in the dark. It wasn't the threat itself that unsettled me. It was the certainty in his eyes, the look of a man who wasn't done. Inside, Anna was waiting at the door, her face pale. "Paul, what's happening?" I hung my jacket on the chair and sat heavily at the table. "Pressure's rising," I said. "He's not scared of me anymore. That means next time, he won't just circle the house. He'll come straight through the door." Anna's hand tightened around mine. "Then what do we do?" I looked toward the uniform hanging in the office, the fabric catching the faint glow of the lamp. "We prepare," I said. Because the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. Every threat is just noise until the moment it comes pounding on your door. And when that night came, I realized David wasn't just reckless, he was desperate. It was a Friday night, the kind that settles quiet after dinner, when the pounding started. Not a polite knock. Not even the angry raps of a drunk neighbor. This was 3 heavy slams against the front door, each one rattling the glass pane and making the frame groan like it might split. I set my glass of water down, slow and careful, and felt that old familiar stillness wash over me, the kind that comes before a raid, before you push open the wrong door and meet whatever waits behind it. It wasn't fear. Fear rattles you. This was calm. Cold. The kind of calm you learn only after years of standing in the middle of chaos and walking out alive. "Paul?" Anna's voice floated down from upstairs, tight with worry. "Who is it?" "Stay upstairs," I called back, steady as stone. "Don't come down." The pounding came again. I approached the door, each step measured, my pulse steady even as my gut told me what I already knew. The silhouette through the frosted glass was broad, shifting impatiently, the faint stench of booze already leaking through the cracks. I opened the door. Slowly. David stood there, swaying on his feet, eyes glassy with drink. His shirt was wrinkled, half untucked, and there was a wildness in his expression, not just drunken bravado, but the kind of desperation that makes a man unpredictable. The air around him reeked of whiskey and gasoline. "You think you can scare me?" he slurred, stepping forward onto the porch, boots heavy on the boards. "Coming to my house in your little costume, talking down to me like I'm some punk kid. You don't run my life, old man. You don't tell me how to treat my wife. My daughter." I corrected him, my voice low and even. That lit something in his eyes, a flicker of rage, humiliation. He jabbed a finger into my chest. "She's my wife. She listens to me. Not to you." From behind me, Anna's quick footsteps creaked on the stairs. "Paul! Back upstairs!" I barked, sharper than I'd meant, but she froze and obeyed. I couldn't afford distraction now. David laughed, a bitter, mocking sound. "See? Even she jumps when you bark. Bet you think that makes you a man. Bet you think wearing that shirt still makes you powerful." He leaned close, breath hot with alcohol. "But you're not a cop anymore. You're just some washed-up has-been hiding behind fabric and memories." I let him talk. "I've always believed silence is the rope a liar uses to hang himself." His words tumbled faster, louder, until finally his hand twitched. It was small, a tightening of the shoulders, the quick clench of his fist. But I'd spent a lifetime watching for that. He swung. It was slow, sloppy, drunk. I stepped aside, his punch slicing nothing but air. I caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted, and pressed down hard on his shoulder. Momentum and training did the rest. His knees hit the porch with a dull thud, a grunt torn from his throat. "Stop!" he shouted, his face contorted with anger and pain. "You'll regret this." "No," I said, calm as ever, voice sharp as glass. "The only one with regrets here is you." I drove my knee into his back, pinning him while twisting his arm just enough to draw a yelp. Not to break, not yet, but to remind him how fragile bones really are. He thrashed once, twice, then went still, panting. The porch was silent except for the night sounds, crickets, a distant dog barking, the faint hum of a car on the highway. I leaned down, close to his ear, my voice steady, deliberate. "You ever lay a hand on Leah again, you won't just deal with me. You'll deal with the system. And I know every lever in that system. I'll drag every lie you've told, every debt, every bar fight, every record into daylight. And if that isn't enough..." I twisted just a fraction harder until he gasped. "Then you and I will have another conversation. One you won't walk away from." For a long moment, he was quiet. Then, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "Fine." I let go and stepped back. He scrambled to his feet, red-faced, holding his arm. His glare was sharp, but the fear was sharper. "Get off my porch," I said. He spat into the boards, muttered curses, but staggered back to his truck. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting across the dark, and then he was gone, tires spitting gravel. I stood there a moment longer, breathing in the night, the adrenaline fading to a cold certainty. This wasn't over. Anna came back down, pale, her hands twisting nervously. "Paul, what if he calls the police? What if he spins this on you?" I looked at her, steady. "Then I'll tell them the truth. And this time, I'll make sure Leah does too. Because this wasn't about a bruise anymore. It was about the line I'd drawn in the sand, and making sure David knew stepping over it again would cost him everything. When a bully runs out of fists, he learns a new weapon, paper. And paper can be slow, but it's patient, it spreads, and it smells like official things people believe." After that night on the porch, a brittle calm settled across our house like a thin sheet. David didn't come around for 3 days. Leah slept at our place more often, curling into the couch like a bird trying to tuck itself small against the wind. Anna watched her with fierce, watchful eyes that made me love her all over again. The family dinners were quiet, the kind of quiet that waits for the next thunderclap. Then the thunder came, but not in the way I expected. One morning there was a flyer tacked to the community board at the grocery store, a short, stark notice about domestic violence awareness. Someone had circled the lines about, "If you witness abuse, call authorities," and written, in block letters underneath, "Beware Paul Carter," along with a phone number. A neighbor recognized my name and asked me, half joking, whether I'd staged a vigil. The joke landed like a stone. People looked at me differently after that. It was petty, but it stung. Petty is the seed of bigger things. 4 days later, Leah handed me an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a copy of a complaint filed with the town's civil court. David was claiming I'd assaulted him on my porch, that I'd threatened him, and that his injuries required medical attention. There was a photo, a grainy cell phone image of David with a red mark along his jaw. The caption read, "Proof." The complaint demanded a restraining order against me and threatened further civil action. The world narrowed into a thin tube of air. I'd pinned him down on the porch. He'd walked away. He'd hurt no one but his pride. But paper is persuasive, and a photograph and a filing looks like evidence to the untrained eye. Leah burst into tears when I read the complaint. "He's trying to ruin you," she sobbed. "He went to a lawyer." Her voice was small in the room. "He's got screenshots, a friend's testimony. He says he fears for his safety." I felt the old instincts surge: documentation, witnesses, chain of custody. This was exactly the pivot I'd feared: move the fight from the messy, public scuffle to the neat, formal world where words on paper can smear a man clean of public sympathy. I called Tom Hayes, a lawyer I knew from my years on the job, quiet, unflashy, with a good sense for the ugly corners of domestic disputes. Tom answered on the third ring. "Paul," he said without preamble, "don't panic. We document, we assemble, we push back. The trick is to make the truth look as official as his fabrications." We met in his office that afternoon, the hum of the air conditioning cutting through the quiet. He drank his coffee black. His fingers drummed a slow pattern on the desk. "What we need," he said, "is evidence. Medical records for Leah. Photos of her bruise from different angles and dates. Texts and call logs showing David's threats. Witnesses who can place him at the truck or the porch. Surveillance footage, if any exists. And this is key, your timeline and demeanor. If they paint you as the aggressor, the judge will look at pattern, not peak. We must be methodical." We left with a list, each item a small weapon: go to the clinic and get Leah's injuries documented, retrieve call logs from provider, talk to neighbors who'd heard the truck, ask the garage boys if David had mentioned filing anything, check for ring or doorbell cameras on the street that might have captured the porch scuffle. The next 48 hours were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. Leah went to the clinic and had the bruise photographed, and notes added to her medical chart. She answered questions with the same tight bravery she'd worn through the rest of this hell. I sat across from her and watched her do it, feeling a swell in my chest that was equal parts pride and sorrow. I went to the shops where David hung out, not to threaten but to remind quietly that there were eyes on him. A kid at the garage, a lanky apprentice with grease under his nails, admitted he'd seen David's truck idling outside my house that night, and remembered the way David talked on his phone afterwards, something about making it stick. Another neighbor had a doorbell camera that showed a portion of David on the porch and, crucially, showed my silhouette stepping out and then the two of them talking. There was no clear strike captured, no dramatic tackle, just movement. Tom subpoenaed that footage the next day. We assembled a folder, dated photographs of Leah's bruises from the clinic, printouts of her recorded statements, text message threads where David's apologies alternated with ugly, possessive lines, the witness notes from the garage kid, the security footage. I wrote a careful, chronological statement explaining the lead-up, the porch confrontation, my attempts to de-escalate, and the fact that I'd left him and returned home without incident. I wrote not as a man boiling with vengeance but as an officer used to documenting incidents. Meanwhile, the town's gossip mill churned. David's friends started a quiet campaign, sympathetic posts, hints that the real story wasn't public, suggestive texts to my old coworkers asking for opinions. The cruelty of it was that it sounded plausible to people who hadn't seen Leah's bruise or heard her voice at 2 in the morning. Anna found herself fielding calls from neighbors and the PDA. "Is it true?" they asked quietly. My daughter's friends' parents texted, worried. The pressure was collateral damage, and it stung in a way I hadn't expected, the slow erosion of trust that takes longer to rebuild than any bruise. At Tom's recommendation, I kept my distance publicly. No dramatic confrontations, no social media posts. He told me to let the paper trail speak. "Don't be the man who escalates," he said. "Be the man who shows proof." It was maddeningly procedural. I wanted to knock on doors, to confront David's lawyer with my hands, to make the lies feel small and pathetic in front of their faces. But Tom was right, the law is not swayed by theatrics. On the day of the temporary restraining order hearing, the courtroom smelled of lemon cleaner and old wood. I sat beside Leah and Anna, the folder from Tom heavy in my lap. The bailiff called the room to order. David sat across, arms folded, chin high. His lawyer rattled off a string of accusations, and the judge listened with impartial calm. When it was my turn, I put the folder on the bench and let Tom walk the judge through the timeline, the medical photos, the witness statements, the security footage, the pattern in the texts. He emphasized Leah's consistency, her injuries documented at the clinic before any of David's public claims, the lack of corroborative evidence for David's version. He made each point with a steady, quiet authority that felt like balm. David's lawyer tried to paint me as overbearing, a meddling father who had provoked an altercation. He called my age and retirement into question, hinted at personal vendettas. But when the judge asked to see the doorbell video, and watched that section where two silhouettes argue with no one appearing to strike the other, there was a shift in the room. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "Temporary measures require probable cause," he said. "Based on the evidence presented here, I'm ordering no restraining order at this time. But I will set a follow-up to evaluate the full record." It wasn't a slam-dunk victory. The judge's language was cautious, not exoneration, merely insufficient proof for immediate civil protection. But in a town that had already started whispering, that measure felt like a small, crucial sanction of reality. It bought us time. When we left the courthouse, Leah hugged me so hard I could feel the tremor in her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to do this without you." I held her and thought of the uniform shirt folded in my closet, the badge weightless in a drawer. The battle was no longer just outside on a porch, it had moved into offices with stamps and lawyers and calendars. Paper might be patient and poisonous, but it was also traceable. And that traceability was our friend. Back home that evening, the house felt heavier and quieter. We had scored a tactical win, but I knew David wasn't done. Men who use the law as a weapon are often the ones who will look for any gap, any procedural loophole, to slip through. He would find lawyers, push narratives, onboard allies. The rumor mill would keep grinding until it met something immovable. I set the uniform shirt on my bed and looked at it. It didn't give me courage in the courtroom, only facts and witnesses did. But it reminded me of what I was trained to do: be methodical, be patient, and be relentless in the right ways. The real work, the long, boring, administrative work of collecting records, corroborating statements, and waiting for the system to do its slow calculus, had just begun. And I'd do it. Not for pride. Not for theater. For Leah. For Anna. For the family whose center I planned to defend with every dull, tidy piece of paper required. Some men think they can twist the truth forever, but lies are like rusty chains, they snap under pressure. And when David pushed too far, the chain broke right in his hands. The weeks after the restraining order hearing were tense but oddly quiet. David hadn't shown up at Leah's place, hadn't circled my house with his truck, hadn't even called. At first, I almost let myself believe the silence meant he was retreating. But experience had taught me better. Silence, in men like him, isn't surrender. It's loading a weapon. The weapon he chose was words. It started small, a Facebook post here, A whispered rumor there. A neighbor mentioned to Anna that David was telling people I'd assaulted him, that I was a bitter old cop with a temper. Then came the screenshots. Anna showed me one on her phone late one evening, her hands shaking as she scrolled. David had written, "My father-in-law is obsessed with control. He wants to ruin me, and now he's brainwashing Leah to turn on me. I fear for my safety every day." There were sympathetic comments beneath. Strangers chimed in with, "Stay strong, man, and toxic in-laws are the worst." One even wrote, "Don't let that old bully push you around. Call the news if you have to." It burned. Not because strangers believed him, but because every like, every share gave him just enough fuel to keep swinging. At church, people avoided us. A couple I'd known for 20 years chose a pew 2 rows back instead of sitting with us. At the grocery store, whispers followed us down the aisle. The small town we'd lived in our whole lives suddenly felt like hostile territory. The hardest blow landed on Leah. One night she sat at our kitchen table, her dinner untouched, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. "Dad," she whispered, "I can't do this anymore. Everywhere I go, people look at me like I'm crazy, like I'm making things up. My boss pulled me aside today and asked if I was safe at home." She choked on the last word. "He meant you." I wanted to storm out of the house, find David, and end this with my fists. But I couldn't. Not with Leah sitting there, trembling, already carrying the weight of his lies. So I took her hand, squeezed it gently. "This isn't your shame, Leah. It's his. He's the liar, not you. And we're going to prove it." That night I called Tom. My voice was low, controlled. "He's poisoning the well." Tom didn't sound surprised. "Then we drain it. We'll file a defamation counterclaim. But more importantly, we'll show the judge a pattern, not just one bruise, but the sequence, the threats, the truck outside your house, the false reports, the smear campaign. Men like him don't stop digging, Paul. Let him dig his own hole." And dig he did. A week later, Leah came home pale as chalk. She told me she'd seen David's truck in her rearview mirror for 10 miles. He hadn't spoken, hadn't touched her, but he made sure she knew he was there, following her down the highway, peeling off only when she pulled into a crowded parking lot. Her hands shook as she told me. "He smiled at me in the mirror, Dad. He smiled." That was the breaking point. The very next day, Tom filed for a protective order, this time not against me, but against David. We included Leah's medical records from the clinic, the photos of her bruises, her sworn statement, the text messages where David's apologies turned into threats, the witness accounts, and now her testimony about being followed. We stapled his false complaint to the back of it, a paper trail of manipulation so obvious even a blind man could see it. When the hearing came, the courtroom was packed. Curious locals filled the benches, reporters scribbled in notepads, the air thick with gossip. David walked in with his chin high, that swagger I'd come to recognize, the kind that cracks the second it meets resistance. His lawyer painted him as a victim of an overbearing father-in-law, a retired cop, abusing his past influence to intimidate an innocent man. The words made me clench my jaw, but I stayed still, hands folded, letting Tom do the work. Piece by piece, lie by lie, Tom dismantled their story. Leah's medical photos. The text where David went from apology to rage in a single breath. The garage kid's statement about David bragging he'd make it stick. The doorbell footage showing David pounding on my door that night, drunk and shouting. And finally, Leah's voice, steady, trembling but strong, telling the court how she'd been followed, how she feared for her life. David couldn't sit still. He muttered under his breath, shook his head, scowled at Leah like she was betraying him by telling the truth. The judge noticed. Everyone noticed. By the time Tom finished, David wasn't a victim anymore. He was exactly what he was, a bully cornered by his own lies. The judge's ruling was firm. A year-long protective order against David. No contact with Leah. No visits to our home. No late-night trucks idling at the curb. His complaint against me? Dismissed with prejudice. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed like justice itself. Leah collapsed against me, sobbing quietly, relief breaking through like sunlight after months of storm. I held her tight, whispering, "It's over, sweetheart. It's over." But when I looked across the courtroom, I saw David's eyes. Red, furious, still burning with hate. And I knew, paper might have stopped him for now. But a man like him doesn't stop just because a judge tells him to. A piece of paper can keep an honest man at bay. But a man like David? Paper only makes him angrier. For a few weeks after the protective order was granted, life almost resembled normal. Leah stayed with us most nights, sometimes falling asleep on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders, her breathing soft, the bruise on her wrist fading into yellow. Anna cooked big dinners, stews, roasts, pies, as if food could stitch back the torn seams of our family. We laughed more cautiously, like people afraid of breaking something fragile. For the first time in months, I let myself think, maybe we're past the worst. But paper is fragile. And David was the kind of man who mistook rules for dares. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening. Leah was driving back from work when she spotted a truck idling on the corner of her street. Same model, same rusted bumper, same crack running like a scar across the windshield. She circled the block, hoping it was a coincidence. But when she came back around, the truck was still there. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped her phone when she called me. By the time I got to her neighborhood, the truck was gone. She stood in her driveway, pale, clutching her keys like a weapon. "Dad, it was him," she said, voice trembling. "I know it was him." The second sign was subtler, but no less chilling. One morning, Anna found our mailbox hanging open, mail scattered across the lawn like confetti. Nothing was missing, but someone had rifled through it. A neighbor mentioned later that he'd seen a man near our box the night before. "Could have been anyone," he shrugged. But the way his eyes slid away told me he knew exactly who it had been. I called the police both times. They logged the incidents, filed reports, nodded sympathetically. "We need clear proof," one officer said. "If he violates the order, get it on camera." So we turned our home into a fortress. Motion-activated floodlights went up on every corner, cameras mounted above the porch and garage. Every time the lights flashed at night, Leah stiffened, her eyes darting to the window. Anna started sleeping lighter, every creak of the house pulling her awake. And me? I walked the halls at night like a guard on patrol, the badge from my drawer heavy in my pocket, though it hadn't been pinned to my chest in years. Then came the night David finally crossed the line. It was just after midnight when my phone buzzed with a notification from the security app. I opened it and froze. There he was, David, standing at the edge of the driveway. Not rushing. Not sneaking. Just standing, shoulders squared, staring at the house. A beer can dangled from his hand, catching the light from the flood lamp. He looked like a wolf watching a herd from the tree, lean, patient, deliberate. For 2 full minutes he stood there, unmoving. Then, slowly, he raised the can, took a long drink, and tossed it into the yard before turning back toward the street. I called the police before the video had even finished saving. "He's here," I said, my voice iron flat. "I have footage. He's violating the order right now." 15 minutes later, red and blue lights danced across the yard. 2 patrol cars pulled up, officers reviewing the footage on my phone. One of them let out a low whistle. "That's a clear violation," he said. "Protective order says 100 yards. He's standing in your driveway. That's more than enough." They drove straight to his house that night and arrested him. When they radioed in the confirmation, Leah broke down, sobbing into her hands. Anna wrapped her arms around her, whispering that it was over, that she was safe now. For the first time in months, Leah's shoulders seemed to unclench, her body sagging with exhausted relief. But me? I stood outside in the cold, staring down at that crumpled beer can in the grass. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand, felt the sticky residue cling to my skin. It wasn't just litter. It was a message. His way of saying, "I can still reach you." Back inside, Anna touched my arm, her eyes wide. Paul, it's done now, right? He'll stay away? I wanted to tell her yes. I wanted to believe the law's weight would finally pin him down. But I'd spent too many years wearing that badge to believe paper and handcuffs could change a man's nature. Arrests don't always reform. Sometimes they just fuel the fire. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed the image from the camera, David standing there, calm, drinking, watching. Not raging, not shouting. Waiting. That was worse than fury. Fury burns out. Waiting means planning. And I promised myself, if he came back again, it wouldn't be the law that stopped him. It would be me. Every war has a moment where words and papers lose their power. For me, that moment came when David decided to turn his rage from shadows to fire. David's arrest bought us only a temporary reprieve. He spent a single night in county lockup before making bail, and by the next morning he was back at the garage, telling anyone who'd listen that I'd set him up. A co-worker of Leah's overheard him laughing, saying, "The old man doctored the footage. He's desperate. Washed up." He said it with bravado, but men like him only laugh that loud when they're covering the taste of bitterness in their mouths. Leah was terrified. She moved into our house full-time, her clothes and bags stacked in the spare room, shoes scattered by the door. Anna tried to make the transition feel normal, putting fresh flowers on the nightstand, folding Leah's laundry into neat stacks. But no matter how homey we tried to make it, we all felt the shift. Our house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a bunker. For the first few nights, the cameras caught nothing more threatening than a stray cat or a raccoon nosing the trash cans. I almost let myself breathe. But then, one Thursday morning around 2 a.m., the alarm buzzed on my phone. I opened the app and froze. Not David himself, but his truck. Parked half a block down, lights out, engine idling. Sitting there in the shadows like a wolf crouched at the edge of the campfire's glow. He wasn't foolish enough to step on the property again, not with the protective order hanging over him like a blade, but he'd found a loophole. Close enough to remind us he was watching. Far enough to claim coincidence. I called the police. A patrol car rolled through 20 minutes later, headlights sweeping the street, but the truck was gone by then. The officer gave me an apologetic shrug. "We'll keep an eye out," he said. "But without clear violation, it's tough." Leah broke down at the breakfast table the next day, tears soaking into the sleeve of her sweater. "Dad," she whispered, "I can't live like this. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill all of us." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Anna wrapped her arms around her, crying silently too. I sat there, watching my wife and daughter tremble, and something inside me solidified. I realized fear wasn't protecting them. The court order wasn't protecting them. I was. That evening, I pulled my old uniform shirt from the closet, buttoned it slowly. The fabric had faded, the creases permanent, but when it settled across my shoulders it felt like armor. I slid my badge into my pocket. Not on display, just close enough to remind me of who I was, of what I'd been trained to do. I drove to the garage just before closing. The lot was mostly empty, fluorescent lights buzzing above the greasy pavement. David was outside, wiping his hands on a rag, talking too loud with one of the younger mechanics. When he saw me step out of the truck, his voice cut off mid-laugh. His eyes dropped to the shirt I wore, and for the first time I saw unease flicker across his face. I walked toward him slow, boots crunching gravel. "You've been circling my house," I said, my voice low but carrying. The younger mechanic froze, then slipped inside without a word, leaving David alone. David smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Coincidence. Free street. Can a man drive where he wants?" I stepped closer, close enough to smell the sour mix of beer and motor oil clinging to him. "Listen carefully. You break that order again, you so much as idle your truck near Leah, and I'll make sure the next arrest doesn't end with bail. And if the law drags its feet..." I leaned closer, my eyes locked on his. "Then you'll answer to me. Do you understand?" He sneered, trying to laugh. You think you scare me? You're old. Soft. All you've got are memories of power. I didn't blink. Maybe. But memories are enough to teach me one thing: I don't bluff. Test me again, and you'll learn that the hard way. For a long moment, silence stretched between us, heavy and electric. His jaw worked as though chewing down words he didn't dare spit. Finally, he muttered something under his breath, threw the rag into the oil pan, and stalked back inside. I stood there in the cooling twilight, listening to the faint hum of the lights, my reflection rippling in a puddle of oil on the pavement. The confrontation hadn't ended with fists or blood. Not yet. But I knew this was the last warning. Driving home, the road blurred with memories of every domestic call I'd ever answered. I'd seen men like David before. They don't stop. They don't retreat. They push until something stops them, hard, permanent, undeniable. As I parked in the driveway, Anna opened the door, Leah behind her, both faces etched with worry. I told them what happened, every detail. Anna's hand trembled in mine, Leah's eyes filled with tears. Dad, she whispered, he won't stop, will he? I shook my head slowly. No, sweetheart. He won't. And in that moment I understood what the end of this war would look like. There wouldn't be more papers or hearings or quiet warnings. There would be one final confrontation. And when it came, only one of us would walk away with his family intact. When a man ignores every warning, every law, every line you draw, there's only one path left. And that night David finally forced me down it. It was a Saturday night, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, like the world is holding its breath. Anna had gone to bed early, worn down from weeks of tension. Leah sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes flicking between the glow of the TV and the front window. I pretended to read in my office, but really, I was just listening to the creaks of the old house, the hum of the heater, the faint whisper of Leah shifting on the couch. Then the motion alarm went off. The screen of my phone glowed on the desk. My gut tightened as I tapped the alert. And there he was. David. Not on the street this time. Not hovering by the mailbox. He was on my porch. Standing squarely in the camera's eye as if daring me to see him. His hand pressed against the glass of the front door. In the other, a crowbar gleamed under the floodlight. I was moving before thought caught up. Down the hall, past the living room. Leah shot to her feet, her face draining of color. Dad? Upstairs. Lock the door. My voice was sharp, commanding. She froze, frightened. But... Go! I barked, louder than I intended. She bolted for the stairs, her footsteps pounding, Anna's startled voice calling from above. I opened the closet, reached for the shotgun I'd kept since my years on the force. My fingers knew the weight, the balance. It was heavier than I remembered, but solid, sure. I racked a shell into the chamber, the sound sharp, metallic. My heart pounded, but my hands were steady. The pounding on the door came next. 3 savage blows that rattled the glass and made the frame shudder. The frosted pane shook with the force. Come out, old man! David roared, his voice thick with drink and rage. Let's finish this! I stepped into the entryway, shadows stretching around me. I opened the door. Slowly. Cold night air poured in, smelling of wet leaves and gasoline. David's eyes widened for a flicker of a second when he saw the shotgun, but pride covered the crack. He raised the crowbar, knuckles white. I told you, I said, my voice low and even. You come back here, you don't leave. For a heartbeat, the world hung silent. Then he stepped forward, bar lifting. The blast tore the night open. The sound thundered through the neighborhood, rattling windows, scattering birds from the trees. David jerked back, the crowbar flying from his grip, clattering against the porch boards. He stumbled, dropped to his knees, eyes wide with shock. Blood spread across his shirt, dark and fast. He gasped once, then fell still. I stood in the doorway, the shotgun heavy in my grip, the smell of gunpowder biting the air. My ears rang, my breath came slow, but my hands didn't shake. Neighbors' lights flicked on. Dogs barked. A car alarm wailed in the distance. Anna rushed down the stairs, Leah clinging to her arm, both of them pale as ghosts. They froze when they saw him lying there, then looked at me, the shotgun still in my hands. "I warned him," I said simply, the words flat, final. Anna covered her mouth, tears welling. Leah's legs gave out and she sank to the floor, sobbing. I set the shotgun down carefully on the porch, sat beside it, and waited. The police arrived in minutes, sirens slicing the night, red and blue lights painting the street. I raised my hands as they approached, calm, compliant. "Weapons here," I told them, nodding at the shotgun. They cuffed me out of protocol, sat me on the curb. I gave my statement, clear, steady. The footage was there. The crowbar was there. The protective order was there. The law was on my side this time. Self-defense. But paperwork doesn't wash the blood from your porch. Hours later, when they finally released me, I came home to find Anna and Leah waiting. Leah threw her arms around me, shaking. "Dad," she whispered, her voice raw. "Thank you. You saved me." I held her, closed my eyes, and breathed in the weight of her words. News traveled fast. By morning, the story was everywhere in town. Retired officer shoots son-in-law in self-defense. Some neighbors dropped off casseroles, offering sympathy. Others whispered that I'd gone too far, that I'd been looking for an excuse. But none of that mattered. The one person who mattered, my daughter, was safe. That night, long after Anna and Leah had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the dark window where David had stood. My chest was heavy, my heart a storm of exhaustion and relief. Revenge isn't always about vengeance, I realized. Sometimes it's about survival. About ending a threat so your family can live without fear. And when the dawn finally crept over the horizon, pale light spilling across the porch, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: David was gone. And he would never hurt Leah again. That was my story. Now I'd like to hear yours. Share it in the comments below.